Welcome to Auto Mundial, the weekly car news and review show, where this week we're previewing the all-new Audi RS3. Does it have what it takes to beat the mighty Mercedes A45?
We also have a look at some legendary Golf GTIs and new releases from Renault. First though, the news.
BMW has launched its first e-drive zones in the UK. As more and more cities around the world begin to introduce low-emission zones, BMW has launched an industry-first software program in Birmingham and London. Known as e-drive zones, areas of the two major cities that are deemed low-emission zones by local authorities are recognised by the hybrid BMW's GPS system, so the car can save electric power if your route is taking you into one of the low-emissions areas. The system can automatically switch the plug-in hybrid BMW to electric power when entering the zone to protect the local environment and save you fuel. The system is standard on all new BMW PHEVs, and it's now available as a free over-the-air update for compatible existing plug-in hybrid models.
Renault has lifted the covers off the all-new KANGOO. As ever, it's a quirky little van-based MPV that puts practicality and value for money above all else. Due to hit showrooms in spring next year, the KANGOO has been completely redesigned with a smart new front end that mimics other cars in the brand's range, with plenty of chrome and some horizontal daytime running lights, which set it apart from rivals from Peugeot and Vauxhall. The interior has been completely modernised too, and is a welcome change from the dated cabin of the old car. While it isn't going to be troubling any Mercs or BMWs, it's up to date and clean, with a big central infotainment screen with smartphone connectivity and all the features that you'd expect in a brand new car. While the full engine lineup is yet to be confirmed, there will be various petrol and diesel options, as well as a fully electric version called the KANGOO E-Tech. Like the previous model, the E-Tech will share its powertrain with the Zoe, which should mean it will be good for 101 brake horsepower and a range of about 170 miles thanks to the 44 kilowatt battery. With rivals like the Citroën Berlingo and Vauxhall Combo leading the class, it's about time that Renault updated its aging KANGOO. Van-based MPVs like this might be a rarer sight on British roads than they once were, but they continue to be popular in Europe, and the KANGOO deserves to be among the best sellers.
Over the last 5 very different decades, one car from Volkswagen has remained a constant. It is the original hot hatchback, and incredibly, there are now 8 different generations to choose from.
So, in all its glory, and maybe some of the bad bits as well, I give you the Golf GTI.
The original Golf GTI was first unveiled in 1976, and then it went on sale in the UK in 1979, and it was a landmark event in the world of cars. 5 decades and 8 generations later, the GTI is still a definitive car, but there have been plenty of ups and downs along the way. Which is why we got all 8 versions together recently to trace the history of the GTI. Starting here with a go in, well, what else? The original Mark I.
It really does feel like it's from a different, not a different era, just a different stratosphere, this car. It definitely feels like a kind of modern vintage car, the original Golf GTI. But look, for heaven's sake, 1976. I think 1978 was the first time I came across one of these. I was about 8 or something at the time, and I was absolutely blown away by it. All the stuff that you kind of interact with, the steering, the brakes, the accelerator, the gear change with the golf ball knob on it, everything has this lovely mechanical honesty to it. It feels lovely, it really does, but it doesn't feel kind of baggy and old and rubbish. It still feels quite taut. It still goes when you put your foot down. I just love this car. I really do love this car. And I'm not just saying that because of this feature. I really want to own one of these.
Join us again after the break for part 2 of our Golf GTI rundown and the wonderful Audi RS3.
Still to come, Audi's new Hyper Hatch, but first more Golf GTI action with the new CLUBSPORT 45.
To see just how much progress has been made over the last 45 years, I drove the latest Mark 8 CLUBSPORT 45 next. The difference between them was startling, to put it mildly.
So you start moving in the Mark 8 and the suspension feels astonishingly refined after the Mark 1. The steering feels totally electronic, totally false. It's you know, completely accurate. You can guide it down the road and place it exactly on the road where you want to, but there is very little pleasure from doing so, I have to say, and the contrast is stark going from one to the other. It really does feel like a computer game steering on this car by comparison to the Mark 1. I mean, it's completely unfair to be doing that, but I'm sitting there thinking this feels like a computer game. But, you know, get used to it, drive it for a bit, do that kind of thing in it. It's a lovely car. It's a lovely, modern, fast, efficient, effective, refined road car. No question about that. But you do wonder whether it actually deserves to have a GTI badge on the tail, or whether it's time that they came up with a different badge. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's pretty alert. Damping is excellent. The ride is very good too on this car. And it looks really nice as well. And it feels really expensive inside. I don't know. Is that evolution? Is that the way everything is going nowadays? Or has the GTI just gone so far away from what the original idea was all about that maybe these things shouldn't be called GTIs anymore? I don't know. This is a lovely car, but it's nowhere near as definitive as the original, or as quite a few of the cars that followed the original. And I don't think it's as good as the Mark 7.
So then I went back in time again, but this time not to the excellent Mark II, which was made between 1984 and 1992, but instead to the Mark III of 1992, and the Mark IV that followed in 98.
So the Mark III was the first real attempt to make the Golf GTI civilised as well as good to drive. And I think it had partial success, not total success. The steering's a bit sort of sludgy and wooden. There's a lot of vertical movement in the Mark III, and there always was. The dampers on this car are not shot. There always was a lot of ever so slightly unchecked, unwanted vertical movement. And it made the Mark III feel quite heavy, a little bit cumbersome. it's perfectly pleasant inside and it's perfectly pleasant to drive. But it doesn't feel like a proper GTI to me. So the moment you get in the Mark IV, you really can tell where Volkswagen spent the money, and you are sitting inside it. This whole interior feels massively better in quality. Just to, you know, the bits that you touch, the design of the instruments, the seat quality, just feeling the gear lever, it just feels much more expensive inside. And the most key bit of all was this, the Jesus handle. They spent hours talking about how expensive feeling and how beautifully damped that was on the launch of this car. And all that was really impressive, and it was true. But at the same time, you kind of thought, well, I'm not sure they've spent the money on the bits underneath, the bits that make the Golf GTI enjoyable to drive. And I remember that distinctly at the time, and it's absolutely the same now. Everything about the way the car goes down the road is perfectly civilised and good and okay, but it ain't no GTI. It never was, and it still isn't. And it's always been a bit of a disappointment, the Mark IV, because of that. They spent the money on the interior, and having spent 2 decades pretty much building a reputation for making the Golf GTI one of, if not the best cars of its type to drive, they then almost threw it all away and sort of went, well, it's all about how nice the interior is, not how good it is to drive. And I think they got it wrong. The Mark IV goes down as, for me personally, it goes down as a low in GTI history.
Fortunately, VW saw the light, reacted to the criticism, and gave us the monumentally improved Mark V GTI in 2004. Indeed, during my day with all 8 GTIs, the all-round excellence of the Mark V is probably what surprised me the most. Why? Because with the Mark V, back came the interior quality, and more to the point, back came a great front-wheel drive chassis, mated to a 2-litre turbo engine that at last had just the right character to its delivery.
Everything about the Mark V addressed whatever they were thinking when they came out with the Mark IV. Also, the Mark V was the first GTI with a dual-clutch gearbox. And that alone puts it down in history as being one of the better GTIs. I think this and the Mark VII, I don't know. I'm driving so many of them now, I'm getting confused. But no matter how many I've driven, the Mark V, it's sweet, it's really good. No compromises here. I really like the Mark V. I'm quite surprised by it. Do you know, I think I might actually be more surprised by this Mark V than by any of the others. It's the dark horse, I'd underrated it, but no, this thing's blinding.
So having righted the ship, the Mark V was followed by the similarly good, but slightly less groundbreaking Mark VI between 2009 and 2013. This model saw the first ever GTI Cabriolet launched, and it was a strong seller throughout its time, even if it wasn't quite as significant as the Mark V. And then in 2013 came the Mark VII. Seen here in performance pack guise, which means it has the differential you want and the blinding dynamic sparkle that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a Golf GTI unless you were familiar with the genius of those originals.
So the Mark VII, now you're talking. The dual clutch was pioneered on the Mark V, but it didn't really start to hit its stride perfectly until this, the Mark VII. I just love everything about the way this car drives, and I think, given a choice of all 8 versions, am I going to say this? Yeah, I am. Nah, you'd have the Mark I. Of course you would, because you'd be mad not to. But in 2021, I think this is the version that I would have, even more so than the Mark 8, because I just prefer the interior for a start. All these haptic controls that you get in the Mark 8, I'm not sure about those. But I think the chassis is better in the Mark 7 than in the Mark 8. I think the steering particularly is better. Feel from the rear axle, turning the lot. It just feels like a 10 out of 10 car, whereas the Mark 8 feels like a kind of 8.5 car. Quick as well, the Mark 7. Great car, great car.
So that's 45 years of the Golf GTI. And I guess what's most obvious about this amazing car is that it represents progress. Sometimes forwards, sometimes backwards. But over time, VW has learned from its mistakes, and the Golf GTI has evolved and become a better car as a result. 5 decades later, it is still a defining car. Whether it'll be around for another 45 years, well, that's another matter entirely.
The Audi RS3 has always been our favourite of the so-called hyper hatches. With its glorious turbocharged 5-cylinder engine and the option to have it with a saloon body, it always made up for its flaws with charm and a sense of character. You see, the outgoing RS3 was never the most dynamically rewarding car in its class, and despite its bigger engine, it wasn't actually that much quicker than the cheaper S3. But the incredible engine, the noise it made, and the fact that buyers had to really appreciate it for what it was, made it a real favourite among those of us who look for more in a car than just performance figures and statistics. Now though, there's a new one. But can it still capture the hearts of petrolheads? Or is it just another fast, blunt instrument? Well, first off, we must say that it looks fantastic. Still available as either a hatchback or a saloon, it looks angry, almost evil, with a sharp, angular face and some Quattro-inspired vents, as we've seen on the new R8 and RS6. The wheel arches have been extended to house the 19-inch alloys, adding to the squat and purposeful rally car look, while around the back we find the familiar oval exhaust tips that have adorned countless RS models from Audi. All good news so far then, but what really matters is what's under the bonnet. And we're thrilled to report that the wonderful 2.5-litre 5-pot motor remains. Power remains the same, with 395 brake horsepower being sent to all 4 wheels. But the 0 to 62 time has dropped from 4.1 to 3.8 seconds. That's supercar acceleration in a family hatchback. For an extra £5,000 or so, Audi will equip your RS3 with the RS Dynamic Pack. This removes the top speed limiter, allowing you to hit 180 miles per hour, while also adding a sports exhaust, adaptive dampers and ceramic brakes for improved stopping power. The new RS3 then is a properly sorted performance car then, but how does it stack up against its arch nemesis, the Mercedes AMG A45?
Well, there are 2 versions available, the regular 382 brake horsepower A45 and the monstrous 415 bhp A45S. Needless to say, that's the one we'll be concentrating on here. Both versions make use of the same engine, a highly strung turbocharged 2-litre, sending power to all 4 wheels via an 8-speed dual-clutch automatic. Despite the extra power though, it can't quite match the Audi in the 0 to 62 mph sprint at 3.9 seconds versus the Audi's 3.8. This being an AMG product, the A45 was always going to be powerful, but the boffins at our Falterbach had been busy working on the chassis too. While the tamer A35 served as a base, the full-fat 45 gets some frequency-selective shock absorbers and a drift mode.
There isn't much separating these two cars then, but we still can't help but love the Audi. It's silly and exuberant, but still a perfectly sensible and practical everyday car. And that's exactly what hot hatchbacks are all about.
Join us again next week on Auto Mundial as we look at the new BMW X3M.